because he went to my college's in-state rival school, and the two of us went at it, hammer and tongs, for 5 minutes, trading the traditional insults between the schools. And then we both sat down. We're like, yeah, we're done.
I'm curious, since we were talking about the team earlier, how did the collaboration process work? Do you divide it up and go into your silos? Do you get together in meetings? I'm really interested in the overall flow. And maybe you could start this question, Jeff.
Wow. Literally, we had a lot of interplay. We had areas where people were working on particular sections, but we had a lot of feedback and going back and forth. What do you think about this? How do we make this work? Basically, are we being too detailed in our gun rules? Are we being detailed enough? Are we looking for realism? Are we looking for a cinematic feel? And as a result, there were a lot of hallway and office discussions. We were all, as Bill mentioned, in a large area with cube walls and everything. So there's a lot of dropping in on each other and basically reviewing each other's works.
I totally agree with what Jeff is saying. You can't write an equipment chapter unless you know like what skills and ability scores are going to look like, because that's what the equipment interacts with. So there was a lot of just me asking, what does this look like? Can I say this? Can I say that?
Right. Class abilities and feats and all of those things are going to, affect what gear you use, what magic items you use when you start talking about urban fantasy and those elements of it. So all of these things, interact. I would also say that we also played a lot, right? So I began very early on a game, a post-apocalyptic setting game. Rich played in it. Mike Selinker, Eric Cagle, James White. There's a bunch of people played, and we started very early in the process. So much so that my players, we play at lunchtime on Wednesdays for an hour or 90 minutes. And my players regenerated their characters, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in the first year of that campaign. I would say it went on for a much longer period than that. But all of that was a matter of taking these elements and I wouldn't even call it play test, because it was earlier than play test. It was more like developmental testing, right? You're putting it out there, you're seeing what's working, what's going in the right direction, and taking it back really even before the text is fully written.
And Bill had a Thursday night game that we were, myself, Michelle Carter, Chris Perkins, Stan Brown, a couple of those who probably I'm missing right at that point, basically, and we would be playtesting mechanics before they actually got onto paper, before, basically we started springing them loose on anything, just to see what worked.
Yeah, Chris and Stan were both in my game as well, so they were getting a double whammy. They were probably, I can't imagine there were times when they were confused, like, okay, is this going to work this way or is it going to work that way? Depending on, which game session they're in.
Yeah. And to all of that, we develop an outline early on, and we split up that outline between the 4 of us to do the writing. And we share the results of our work together and give feedback and all that kind of stuff. I tend to work on the front of the book, the introduction, the basics of character creation. That was where I started working on initially, because that's the stuff you need to get those playtests going. And then beyond that, it's just a matter of what's working and what sticks to the wall, as they say.
Right. And we did have a formal meeting structure as well. It wasn't all the informal stuff. Actually, all of that was what hung off of regular team meetings to talk about what was going on.
Yep.
I remember feeling very supported by the whole department. Like D20 Modern was a big deal, and everybody wanted it to succeed. And so, there was a lot of buy-in for these kind of play sessions to test the rules. Everybody wanted to be in on it and to contribute to the success of the product.
Sounds like it was a lot of fun, actually. And, I reflect, I think that environment, where all the designers are together in one room, working together, in the last couple of years, that's become a bit of a rarity, right? So it's kind of nice to have that opportunity, I think. So how did you guys settle disagreements? There must have been cases where, one person likes one, another person likes the other. So how did you adjudicate these situations?
Bill gets to be the grown-up.
Yeah, I listen to everything. I want to hear what everybody has to say, but at the end of the day, if there's a disagreement, someone's got to make a call, and that's what they paid me for. So.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But I do feel like that. I feel like that was a positive thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like because Bill had I felt like Bill had a clear vision for the product, right? And so every time he had to make a decision, he was deciding from that clear vision. And over time, we bought more and more into that clear vision. And there were fewer and fewer disagreements because we were all getting on the same track. And that's a credit to Bill.
You also helped clarify that vision, right? I did have a vision to start, but it takes shape as we work through it together.
Right. And we talk about like divisions, and there were certainly points at which people would be very passionate about a particular point of view, but ultimately it's a consensus building process, right? Like Bill would make a final call, but I don't recall any time where anybody like stormed back to their desk upset that was the call that was made. I don't know, at least from my end, maybe that happened. I don't know, but I don't think so. I think, by and large, we worked on the development of this game for months and months and months. And, as you say, the vision was coming together. It wasn't one of necessarily like hammering it together.
I remember because I had interviewed Dubu from customer service over to RPG R&D just in like 1999. So very recent to this happening. And part of the interview process was bringing somebody into the interview who could pick a fight with me to see if I could defend myself without getting like really angry, right? Like without getting violently angry. And they picked Rich Baker because he went to my college's in-state rival school, and the two of us went at it, hammer and tongs for 5 minutes, trading the traditional insults between the schools. And then we both sat down. And we're like, yeah, we're done. That's it. It was just.
And to be clear, what he's talking about there is.
Go ahead.
What he's talking about there is UVA and Virginia Tech, and I'm also a Hokie, so there's that as well.
What, do you remember any points of disagreement where you had to, you had two different choices and had to try and pick one of the two directions?
Yeah. Forgive and forget.
I mean, it's 20 years ago.
Yeah, no problem. Right. So I'm curious, you're talking about the process of making the decisions. Do you remember any situations where you had two ways to go and each had a champion and you had to make a tough call between them?
So one of the elements that I was involved in the design of and was a bit controversial in the end was the wealth system. Because, when you start out, right, like the classic thing is you say, well, this sword costs 25 gold pieces and, a 10-foot pole costs a gold piece or whatever, and all that sort of stuff. And we follow that pattern initially as well. But in a game that was designed to be very universal and to look forward, to exist in a post-apocalyptic cashless world and a science fiction world with all kinds of stuff, and the modern world where you have credit and all these other elements, the value of cash is something very different. In a modern game setting, right, you could either have, night vision goggles and a crowbar and a handgun and blah, 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 or you can have a car if you gave people $10,000 to start with. So I advocated for a system that was a little bit more logarithmic and was based on making checks just like skills and to acquire equipment. And, I think that was one that, well, first of all, it took a long time to get it right. So maybe initially presented it was unwieldy or difficult or whatnot. And ultimately not all gamers loved it. But it solved that problem, and we did have to really work through how it was going to be made. I don't remember how people's thoughts fell on that individually. I don't remember if specifically, Jeff hated it and Rich loved it or whatnot. But I do remember it was something we talked about a lot. Rich did not love it. There we go.
No, and it's not because I thought there was anything in particularly wrong with it. At that point, I had been through the actual real life process of buying a house, so I understood. What Charles was getting at and how he was sort of modeling the underlying banking systems of the modern world. But I had just done a ton of research on what things cost, and all of that had to get chucked out the window with Charles's system. So Rich wasn't happy because he was just sort of disappointed at all the work he had put in that was ultimately not going to be useful.
Yeah, and that's a good example of what we were saying before about how working on one system affects what's going on with another system, right? Like it has to always be talking to each other.
So I remember designing, as part of the firearms design, writing a rule system for weapons jamming, because I thought anything that can randomly throw a roadblock in front of the player characters creates drama, right? It's a role-playing opportunity. How do you deal with this difficulty is role-playing and dramatic. And Charles argued that modern ammunition is so well produced that jams are just not very frequent things. And ultimately, we talked it into it needs to be the DM's decision. If you roll a 1, which is an automatic miss, does that mean that the gun jams? Does that mean that something else terrible happened? We're going to leave that to the DM and not use that rule system.
I think itself, putting in a jamming rule ended up, just being one more kicking people when they were down. Bad enough you've missed. You've rolled horribly. Let's make matters worse. So, one, everybody laughs at you, and and we can have something that follows on for that from a GM standpoint. But as far as the mechanic itself, putting in a jamming rule ended up, just being one more kicking people when they were down. Bad enough you've missed.
Right.
You've rolled horribly. Let's make matters worse. So.
Right. And over the years, I've become 100% an adherent to what Rich just said, which is that the unexpected little minor adversity in a scene that has a lot of tension just ratchets up that tension and makes it more fun. But on the other hand, you also have to be really careful about making something like that happen 5% of the time, right?
Well, even a 1% chance of a jam often creates a difficulty. And basically, you get double zeros, and it's not a good thing, which is not rewarding within play. You were talking about wealth. That what you had developed in part out of the old Marvel superheroes. We had a wealth stat as well, where basically we're rolling against it. So we've had mechanics that we've used previously that we continue to evolve and continue to bring forward. The logarithmic scale, basically getting a lot more accurate with the expenditures, and that I think made D20 Modern work very well as well.
Yeah, I don't remember the details, but I do remember that Charles and I talked a lot about that wealth system because I had concerns about how it was going to work out, and ultimately, what's there we all agreed upon. But I do remember that was one of the places we made the biggest change to the original design.
And as I was reading D20 Modern, one thing that jumped out at me is in the area of the wealth system, it's one of the places in the game where you explain your design decision a little bit. There's some text justifying why the system works the way it does and what your thought process was behind it, which you don't usually see a lot in rule books, but sometimes comes up, especially when a feature required a lot of thought and there were a lot of back and forth about how it should go.
And also, I think when it is not necessarily what the player expects, right? So traditional gaming is literally, 25 gold pieces for the sword or whatever, right? People, and then they look at this and say, well, why didn't you just do that? And there were good reasons, but they weren't necessarily obvious right on the surface. And again, maybe in a particular style of play, right? If you're going to run a Call of Cthulhu game, like to you, is really straightforward. Why doesn't this cost this? Why doesn't that cost that? But the rule book had to be written for that. It had to be written for playing The Expanse. It had to be written, which of course didn't exist at the time, written for playing a Jim Butcher style game. It had to be written for a Mad Max style game or a Deadlands style game. It had all these different styles it had to address. And so kind of letting the player, the reader, peek behind the curtain there, is, I think, beneficial for that.
I agree.
Yeah, certainly. We try not to, the goal is not to copy, but to homage. It's an homage to a certain type of character.
Right.
Makes sense.